This is the presentation on the Cuban Revolution that happened in the 1950s. Former Army Sergeant Fulgencio Batista was the Cuban president from 1940 to 1944. He ran for president again in 1952, but when he was not going to win, he decided to take the presidency using force. Under Batista's reign, many people were unemployed and the country's water system was not functional. Furthermore, Batista was embezzling money from the country for himself and his supporters. Fidel Castro, a young lawyer, formed a plot to take down Batista. Fidel and his brother Raúl started a resistance group called the Movement. On July 26, 1953, 138 movement fighters attacked the Moncada barracks. Due to the lack of numbers and arms, the attack failed and many of the rebels were killed or captured. Fidel and Raúl were among those captured. The two brothers were imprisoned in Mexico. In Mexico they met Che Guevara. Che joined the movement with them and went back to Cuba on a boat called Granma. Upon landing in Cuba, the movement was met by Batista's government. The battle left only 22 movement survivors who fled to the Sierra Maestra Mountains. In the mountains, the movement was able to regroup, getting their numbers to about 300 members. The movement attacked Batista's palace and broadcasted the 3 Minutes of Truth. These 3 minutes of TV time brought in many members to the movement. After this happened, Batista tried to hold on to as much power as he could. He closed the University of Havana and publicly executed anyone who wouldn't support him. This led to the U.S. to stop supporting Batista. On August 21, 1958, Castro came out of the mountains and began to take over towns one by one. The Battle of Santa Clara took place on December 31, 1958. Batista lost and fled to the Dominican Republic. The movement had succeeded in taking over Cuba. The next day they marched towards Cuba's capital, Havana. In Havana, Fidel and the movement were tasked with building a new government. Manuel Leo was the first Cuban president after Batista. Although the movement had defeated Batista, there was still much more for them to do. From the beginning, Leo made political decisions that Fidel Castro did not approve of. Eventually, Castro received the position of prime minister. Leo and Castro were constantly disagreeing about what to do with their newfound power. One of their main disputes was on the ideology of communism. While Leo was in strong opposition to it, Fidel Castro was not against the idea. All of these problems led to Leo's resignation in July of 1959. Fidel Castro now had control of Cuba. His new government was communist, which basically means that everything is publicly owned and no individual can own land or resources. The United States is a capitalist country, which basically is the opposite of communism. They did not approve of the way Fidel was governing his country. Furthermore, he had ties to the USSR, which was one of the United States' enemies at the time. All of these complications led to a trade embargo between the United States and Cuba. Over 50 years later, the American trade embargo with Cuba still stands. Although it has not totally been diminished, former U.S. President Barack Obama lightened the rules to the embargo. In 2015, he eased restrictions on Americans traveling to Cuba. Americans are now able to visit Cuba for business or for vacations. Official trade between the two countries is not completely restored though, meaning no Cuban exports can come to America and no American exports can come to Cuba. So, some might say that isn't much, but they're the first step to everything. Perhaps the lifting of the travel ban to Cuba is one of the first steps to better relations with Cuba.